Qian Zhongshu is a very interesting case in the history of modern Chinese literature. He didn't actually write a whole lot in terms of fiction or essays or poetry. Most of his popular reputation rests on his novel Fortress Besieged from 1947. And even though he had a career that went on for decades, it was mostly a scholarly career. And so why did he have this kind of outburst of creativity in the 1930s and 1940s? And then it suddenly disappeared. But after the 1980s, he was suddenly rediscovered as this major hidden literary talent in China. And in this brief video lecture about Qian Zhongshu's biography and how it relates to some of his works, I really want to focus on why he is so deserving of attention. If you're interested in Fortress Besieged, I have also produced 3 video lectures specifically about that novel. You can also learn more from the video lectures and other materials that I have posted on the Modern Chinese Cultural Studies YouTube channel, where there's a full playlist about Qian Zhongshu and Yang Jiang. Qian Zhongshu was born into a relatively well-off scholarly family in the major city of Wuxi in Jiangsu province. He had a multilingual education. He studied at a missionary school. He studied foreign languages and literatures at Beijing's Tsinghua University, where he met his wife, Yang Jiang. He and Yang Jiang later went on to travel and study abroad in Europe. So after teaching for a couple of years at a university in Shanghai, Qian won a full tuition scholarship to study at Oxford's Exeter College, and he and Yang sailed there. They spent a couple of years there and in Paris, where Qian studied at the Sorbonne. And it was really during this time in Europe that he read extremely widely and began his literary career. He is known mostly as a literary critic and a creative writer, and a scholar with tremendous knowledge of both the Chinese literary tradition and multiple Western literary traditions, and one that he could access because of his polyglot abilities in multiple European languages. He had a classical Chinese education with his father, who was a literary scholar and historian in his own right. You can visit the old Qian family home in Wuxi if you're so curious. Qian Zhongshu's reputation as one of China's most cosmopolitan literary figures, I think, really began with his time at Oxford and Paris, where he broadly extended his reading in multiple genres of literature. He wrote a 2-part thesis about the representation of China in 17th and 18th century European literatures. And after he returned to China with Yang Jiang and their infant daughter, China was in the midst of war against Japan. It had been invaded in 1931. Full-scale war broke out in 1937. And Qian taught at his alma mater. He was recruited to teach there. But Tsinghua University had had to move down to the southern city of Kunming. So Qian taught there for a while. He also taught at another institution in the interior. And finally, he moved to Aurora Women's College and taught there, where he was reunited with his wife and daughter. And actually, during the war period, it deserves to be mentioned that Yang Jiang actually financially supported her husband as a successful playwright and a tutor and teacher. But it was really during this period of the late 30s and 40s that Qian Zhongshu did most of his creative writing. And so the ties between war and literary creativity are particularly tight in Qian's case. But even then, there's some things about Qian that do seem to transcend whatever era he was writing in. So if you look at the preface to the story collection that he wrote during the war and published in 1946, this is one of the comments that he makes about his subjects. Let me declare categorically that the characters and events in this book are completely fictitious. Not only are the humans within its pages good, law-abiding citizens, but its beasts are domesticated pets, and even its ghosts are not those homeless spirits that roam about unchecked. As I mentioned before, his literary reputation rests primarily on this novel, Fortress Besieged. It was one that he wrote primarily during the anti-Japanese war while he was in Shanghai. It was published during Civil War, and I think this is one of the reasons that even though the novel was quite popular then, things trailed off. China was in the midst of internecine conflict. There was tremendous hyperinflation. It was not a great time to launch a literary career. And so the novel really fell into obscurity. Its politics were not Maoist politics. They did not chime with this new regime founded in 1949. And so it really was not until the cultural thaw of the 1980s, after the death of Mao Zedong and the reform and opening period, that he was rediscovered. And people found what a treasure trove this novel truly is. I would mention that in addition to writing fiction and essays, Qian was also an avid poet and a huge fan of Chinese poetry. And much of his literary criticism is poetry criticism. During the period of Mao Zedong's reign from 1947 up until just before the Cultural Revolution in 1966, Qian turned from being a creative writer to primarily an academic. He was recruited into essentially a literary research academy up in Beijing, what later became the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Yang Zhang worked there as well. They both were translators. They both wrote academic articles and criticism. Qian Zhongshu also had the unique experience of being recruited into an elite team that rendered Chairman Mao's poetry into English, as well as some of his other selected works. The Cultural Revolution completely disrupted Qian Zhongshu and Yang Zhang's life in Beijing. They, like many intellectuals at the time, were branded these stinking, useless intellectuals and told that they had to go down to the countryside to be re-educated by the peasants. So their work was essentially interrupted. They spent some time, cleaning toilets and doing menial labor in the city before they were sent down to essentially become farmers. This was also a period in which they were estranged from their adult daughter, and their son-in-law actually committed suicide under political persecution. So Yang Zhang wrote a very interesting memoir about their time in the countryside, which I highly recommend. I think that Qian Zhongshu's preface to that work is also quite revealing. It's one in which this very guarded author actually admits feeling this sense of shame and not speaking up to prevent a lot of the injustices that were being perpetrated in this era against friends and colleagues. Qian Zhongshu, during this period, however, did write, and much of the work that he did was literary criticism. And this is a remarkable work which most people have heard of but never read, because it's hard to read even for so-called native speakers of Chinese. It's written in classical Chinese, and in a type of classical Chinese that is very, very difficult. It's extremely literary, lots of allusions, and it's not written just in classical Chinese. If you look at an average page from this work, you can see there are many, many languages. So Qian Zhongshu is really bringing this multilingual mastery to bear on literary criticism and doing something that was quite radical in an age where everything was supposed to be simplified, everything was supposed to be accessible for and by the people. So in the 1980s, Qian was rediscovered, and things really launched into the stratosphere in the 1990s after Fortress Besieged was adapted into a TV serial starring Chen Daoming as Fang Hongjian, the protagonist, who is a kind of ne'er-do-well who has studied abroad, but not really studied. He's mostly goofed around. It was all financed by his ex-fiance's father, and he returns to China with a bogus degree and pretends to live a kind of dilettantish life in Shanghai before things go bad in a love affair, and he flees to the interior. So it's a very picaresque novel, and one that was so different that people wanted to find out, who was the guy who wrote this novel? Let's say you ate an egg and enjoyed it. Would you really need to go and find the hen that laid it? So that's how he said thanks but no thanks to people who looked him up. What we have today is a man with a larger-than-life reputation, where there's no kind of latter-day Qian Zhongshu. No one has really followed in his footsteps, because nobody has mastered the same array of languages. No one has had the sensibility to put together a dialogue between Chinese and French and German and Italian, writers from all different ages. He was a critical genius who had kind of sparkled with insight. And some of this does work into works like Fortress Besieged as well, where you can see there's so much about writing and writers and ideas that is threaded through the plot of this novel. And if you want to get a sense of his influence, even popular novels from the 21st century like Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem. One key work that shaped popular perception of Qian Zhongshu, the man behind the writings and behind the reputation, was his widow, Yang Zhang's 2003 memoir, We Three, about her life, his life, and their family life with their daughter, Qian Yuan. It is part fiction, part family scrapbook, and part memoir, in which she recounts their life at Oxford, their life during the Cultural Revolution, and also her experience of losing him to illness in the 1990s, so his late years in decline. There are a lot of revelations in this work. We have glimpses into the domestic life of this famous couple. There really was this kind of story circulating about Qian Zhongshu and Yang Zhang as being emblems of an old-style intellectual, of a kind of bygone sensibility that was very, very bookish, had mastered the Western classics as well as the Chinese classics. And so there even, kind of cover page figures of a match made in heaven. However, they also had a daughter who was was kind of written back into the narrative by Yang Zheng's work, We Three. There had been so much focus on the couple. They also had a daughter with whom they had a very rocky relationship, but Yang Zheng represents it as being a very close and affectionate one. And Yang Zheng's book, We Three, also inspired Qian Yuan's former colleagues and students to collect their own memoirs about her in this book, Our Qian Yuan. If you're curious to learn more about Qian Zhongshu, the man, the scholar, and the writer, I would suggest the collection of essays, China's Literary Cosmopolitans, that talks about his intertwined career with Yang Zheng. Duncan Campbell has translated some of Qian's literary criticisms, mostly from the mid-century, called Patchwork. There's also a critical biography of Qian Zhongshu by Ted Hooters. There's also a massive array of reading notebooks that Qian left behind, some in English, some in French, some in German and Italian and other languages, as well as Chinese. And these are really fascinating. Very few people looked at them except scholars, but if you look at just a couple pages, some of that wit and erudition and sense of style and self-possession really comes through from these works from the 1930s all the way up into late life. There's also the Qian Zhongshu collection. He famously wrote in one work about a character just called the writer. Don't collect my works into a collected works, a quanji, but we do have the Qian Zhongshu collection. And as I mentioned before, there's the Qian Zhongshu Yang Zheng playlist.